Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today's story is not just another chapter in an ongoing conflict. It is a moment that many once believed would never arrive. A moment that reshapes history, rewrites assumptions, and forces the world to rethink what it thought it understood about this war. Crimea is back under control, and what we are witnessing now is history in the making. For years, Crimea stood at the center of gravity of this conflict. It was more than a peninsula. It was a symbol of power, permanence, and defiance. It represented the idea that some changes on the battlefield could never be reversed. That once a line was crossed and fortified deeply enough, it became permanent. That belief has now been shattered. The return of Crimea under control marks one of the most consequential shifts in the entire war. It is not only about territory regained, but about what that regain represents politically, militarily, psychologically, and globally. To understand why this moment matters so deeply, we must go beyond headlines and look at the full picture of how Crimea shaped the war, why it was considered untouchable, and how its return changes everything moving forward. Crimea has always carried a weight far heavier than its size. When it was seized years ago, it became the cornerstone of a broader strategy. It offered access to the Black Sea, dominance over key maritime routes, and a powerful military platform from which influence could be projected far beyond its shores. It also became a symbol used to demonstrate strength at home and resolve abroad. For Ukraine, Crimea was a constant reminder of unfinished business. No matter how the war evolved, no matter what happened on other fronts, Crimea remained the ultimate objective. It was the piece of the puzzle that had to be restored for the country's sovereignty to feel whole again. Every strategy, every sacrifice, and every long-term plan was shaped by the reality that Crimea was still out of reach. For much of the world, Crimea became the frozen question. Diplomats spoke around it. Analysts debated whether it could ever realistically change hands. Some argued that Crimea would only be resolved at a negotiating table. Others believed that any attempt to reclaim it would trigger uncontrollable escalation. Over time, a quiet consensus formed in many circles that Crimea was simply too fortified, too symbolic, and too dangerous to touch. That assumption is now gone. Crimea did not fall overnight. Its return was not the result of a single battle or dramatic announcement. It was the culmination of a long, deliberate process that unfolded over time, often quietly, sometimes invisibly to the outside world. What we are seeing now is the final result of months and years of pressure, adaptation, and strategic patience. The first stage was isolation. Crimea's strength depended on its connections. Roads, bridges, sea routes, and supply chains kept the peninsula operational. Slowly but deliberately, those connections came under pressure. Each disruption made resupply more complicated. Each delay increased strain on the forces stationed there. Over time, the cost of holding Crimea began to rise while the benefits began to shrink. The second stage was degradation. Military infrastructure that once seemed secure became vulnerable. Air defenses were challenged. Command centers were disrupted. Storage facilities were targeted. Naval assets faced increasing risk. The idea of Crimea as a safe rear base began to dissolve. The fortress started to feel less like a shield and more like a trap. At the same time, the psychological environment shifted. Troops stationed in Crimea were no longer isolated from the war's intensity. The sense of permanence disappeared. Uncertainty replaced routine. Morale, which had been sustained by the belief that Crimea was untouchable, began to erode. When soldiers no longer believe they are defending an unbreakable position, everything changes. The information space also played a role. Narratives that once emphasized control and stability struggled to explain mounting disruptions. Each incident raised questions that could not be fully answered. Confidence at home weakened. International perceptions began to shift. Crimea was no longer seen as an immovable fact, but as a contested reality. When the final phase arrived, it moved faster than many expected. Once the balance tipped, once holding Crimea became more costly than relinquishing it, events accelerated, defensive lines weakened, coordination faltered. Decisions had to be made under pressure and uncertainty. In such moments, even heavily fortified positions can unravel with surprising speed. Crimea came back under control. That moment alone would be historic, but its implications go far beyond the peninsula itself. Militarily, the battlefield has been transformed. Crimea had served as a launchpad for operations across southern regions. Its return immediately altered the geometry of the conflict. Supply routes were disrupted. Range and coverage changed. Coastal dynamics shifted. Control of the Black Sea entered a new phase. What was once a strategic advantage became a strategic void. For Ukraine, this meant increased operational freedom. Southern fronts became more secure. Maritime routes gained new significance. Defensive planning could shift from constant reaction to proactive positioning. The war map was not just redrawn, it was rebalanced. Psychologically, the impact is even deeper. Wars are fought not only with weapons, but with belief. For years, the idea that Crimea could never be reclaimed weighed heavily on Ukrainian society. It was a lingering doubt, a shadow over every success. Its return replaced doubt with confidence. It reinforced the belief that persistence matters, that long-term strategy can overcome even the most entrenched obstacles. On the opposite side, the loss of Crimea shattered a core narrative. Crimea was not just territory, it was proof. Proof that certain gains were permanent. Proof that resistance was futile. Proof that time would solidify control. When that proof vanished, it created a vacuum. Questions that had been suppressed resurfaced. Trust in strategy weakened. Confidence eroded. Politically, the consequences are enormous. Crimea had been central to years of messaging, justification, and sacrifice. Its loss cannot be easily reframed or minimized. It forces a reckoning. Domestically, it raises questions about decision, making, and direction. Internationally, it weakens negotiating leverage. Crimea can no longer be used as a fixed reference point in talks about the future. For Ukraine, Crimea's return strengthens legitimacy on every level. It reinforces sovereignty. It validates resistance. It unites political forces around a tangible achievement. It changes how allies view long-term commitments and outcomes. It turns abstract support into concrete results. Globally, this moment is being watched closely. Other regions with frozen conflicts are paying attention. Analysts are reassessing assumptions about permanence and power. The idea that time always favors the occupier has been challenged. The belief that fortified positions are immune to long-term pressure has been questioned. This is why Crimea's return is not just a regional event. It is a signal. It signals that modern conflicts are not static, that adaptability can overcome entrenchment, that patience, combined with strategy, can change outcomes that once seemed inevitable. It reminds the world that history is not finished being written. At the same time, it is important to understand that history in the making does not mean history completed. The return of Crimea does not automatically end the war. In fact, it introduces a new phase filled with uncertainty. Turning points are often the most dangerous moments in any conflict. They force decisions, they provoke reactions, they narrow options. What happens next will depend on choices made in the aftermath. Will this moment accelerate movement toward negotiations, or will it harden positions? Will it lead to restraint or escalation? Will it open space for diplomacy or close it? These questions have no easy answers. What is certain is that the war after Crimea is fundamentally different from the war before it. Strategies must be rewritten, assumptions must be revisited, alliances must adapt, military planning on all sides must account for a reality that few believed possible not long ago. Crimea back under control changes timelines. It changes how victory and defeat are defined. It changes how long-term security is envisioned. It changes the psychological landscape in which every future decision will be made. This moment will be debated, analyzed, and argued over for years. Historians will trace its origins. Military experts will dissect its execution. Political leaders will reference it in speeches and policies. It will become a marker, a before and after point in the narrative of this war. But for now, we are living inside it. We are witnessing history as it forms, not as it is remembered. Crimea's return stands as a reminder that even in the darkest, most prolonged conflicts, outcomes are not fixed. That endurance matters, that strategy matters, that belief matters, and that history does not belong solely to those who claim it first, but to those who are willing to pursue it the longest. As the world watches what comes next, one truth stands above all others. Crimea is back under control, and with that, a new chapter has begun, one that will shape not only the future of this war, but the broader understanding of power, resistance, and possibility in the modern world. Thank you for watching. Stay informed, stay safe, and we'll see you in the next update.